Hi guys, I'm Maria Drutska and today we will talk about the nuclear threat from Belarus, Budanov's death and other stuff that has happened recently. I think great topics. The mini dictator is once again attracting attention and the Russians are launching another IPSO. The self-proclaimed president of the Republic of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, has apparently recovered from his recent illness and has again started to break into the news agenda. This time Lukashenko's statement looked quite serious. It was announced about Belarus obtaining tactical nuclear weapons. Let's figure out what's going on and how all this works. Belarus has long been an ally of the Russian Federation, although honestly the word ally is no longer appropriate here. You can use the word satellite or vassal. And forgive me, all Belarusians who, one way or another, fighting with Russia and Lukashenko's regime. But it is so. Dependence on Russia is expressed in numerous ship-cast contracts, many loans, most of which are forgiven to Belarus, integration of Belarus into Russia as a part of the so-called Union State, and interaction between the Russian and Belarusian armies in numerous exercises, and the placement of Russian forces in Belarus, of course. The final chord was the attack of Russia from the territory of Belarus on Ukraine on February 24, 2022. This step formally made independent Belarus one of the parties of the conflict and therefore further training of Russian soldiers on Belarusian polygons and the transfer of equipment and ammunition to Russians no longer surprised anyone. At the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Lukashenko, in the best traditions of Russian propaganda, announced the capture of Kyiv in 3-4 days, plans for another attack on Belarus from 4 directions, and various similar nonsense. But at the same time, even at the initial stage of the invasion, Lukashenko did not let the Belarusian armed forces be drawn into this war. Why did this happen? Despite all the disgust for Lukashenko as a dictator, he was and remains an experienced politician who tries to play on different fields, interacting very well both with Russia and with Ukraine and the countries of the collective West. Now let's consider what we have as tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. Not long ago, Russian propaganda accused the British of supplying shells with depleted uranium cores, claiming this would be horrible environmental damage and that we would all die as a result. At the same time, the Russians began to assert that they reserve the right to respond symmetrically. Such a response, in fact, involved deploying tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus to be stored on appropriate facilities built during the Soviet Union era. The problem is that Russia had already planned to deploy its nuclear weapons in Belarus and had repeatedly announced this. In turn, despite all Lukashenko's statements, nuclear weapons have been and remain under the control of the Russian military with absolutely no relevance to Lukashenko. Therefore, what we saw was a great show from which the Belarusian dictator tried to gain something. I also want to remind you that Kirill Budanov has repeatedly stated in his interviews that Belarus does not intend to directly enter this war and a dialogue is being conducted with a self-proclaimed president of Belarus, mediated by individual deputies of the Ukrainian parliament. If we have already mentioned Kirill Budanov, let's move on to the new fakes from Russian propaganda. But before we do, I would like to ask you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and if you wish, you can always support us on Patreon and buy me a coffee. Thank you. Recently, Russian propaganda has already killed Valery Zaluzhny, trying to sow panic among our civilian population and military, as well as demonstrate the results of strikes on decision-making centers to their own population. Now, Russian propagandists decide to kill Budanov. How did it happen? Relatively recently, Russian official media and a little later various so-called unofficial sources began to report that as a result of the strike by high-pressure weapons on the building of the main intelligence directorate in Kiev, the chief of Ukrainian intelligence officer Kirill Budanov was seriously injured and was urgently evacuated, first to Poland and then to Germany. Budanov's condition is supposedly very critical and perhaps he is already dead. This was illustrated by the building of the main intelligence directorate, which was supposedly scorched from some ignition. The funny thing is, despite certain damage to the building, there were no signs of any critical damage. But after a while, Budanov records a video in which he is safe and unharmed, and Russian propaganda once again makes itself look extremely foolish. Why do they do such things? I am already working on a video in which we will dissect in details how Russian informational psychological operations IPSO works. In short, not always is propaganda directed at Ukrainians. The target may be both the Russian population, which is already ready to believe anything because of the lack of information and other sources, and our Western partners who, when loud news breaks out, start actively scrolling news feeds and spreading panic. Therefore, be careful and always check the information you consume. I'm Maria Drutska, and Slava